You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, greetings again, everyone. You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I'm your host, Doug Thorpe. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a detour in our normal thought process. I've invited a gentleman. His name is Keagen Hadley. Keegan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Doug.
What I'm going to let him explain to you is his background, but the theme and the direction we're going is the idea that if you've ever experienced a serious physical injury, your recovery may take many weeks or months to get you there, but part of it is your own psychology and your mental state recovering from that. And I know I've endured my own. I've had some foot surgeries that took a while to recover. And, you know, when your mobility is impacted and even just the simple things of the way you move around can have a real challenge for your headspace. So, Keegan, tell us a little bit about your background and your journey and how you got into this work.
Yeah, so I was an athlete for a very long time. I played American football for, almost 2 decades. I played through college and then briefly after in the arena football leagues. And throughout that time, I endured a lot of physical injuries, as you would imagine, playing football. I had a lot of concussions, and I actually tore both of my ACLs, requiring 4 surgeries. So as a result of that, I noticed throughout my career that I actually struggled more with the psychological impact of physical injuries than actually the physical recovery itself. So that's kind of what I noticed. And then, after a number of life occurrences happening, I learned and came upon psychological flexibility, and that truly changed the trajectory of my life. And I'm hoping to provide those skills as in my lessons so that others don't end up in the places I was.
So, what was the word? Psychological flexibility?
Yep. Psychological flexibility, or acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
Okay. So tell us more about what that really means.
Yep. So ACT is kind of a close cousin, I guess you'd say, to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very common when you think of someone going to a therapist to talk about maybe their problems. Most of the time, they're likely practicing CBT. And it's very closely related to that. But Dr. Stephen Hayes is kind of the father, the founder of ACT. And its only difference is what it is looking to accomplish via therapy. So instead of just alleviating your negative symptomology, it's trying to prepare you for the inevitable, that is life. Essentially, there's going to be trials and tribulations. There's going to be difficult times, and it's just trying to prepare you for that. And I can go into the 6 foundational principles or pillars of ACT, as well as the slight nuances if you want. I don't want to just ramble on though. So
yeah. Well, I guess I want to kind of set the framework, and then we may well dive into those. But so part of what comes to my own mind about these things is one of the obvious dynamics that inevitably may happen is somebody suffers a severe injury, may require surgery, may not, maybe it is an extended fracture recovery period, major bone or something like that. But inevitably, what makes headline news is the whole idea of getting addicted to painkillers. Mm-hmm. So you usually are prescribed some form of pain med with that recovery process, and there's that challenge of, and I'll say right now, and I'll call it a disclaimer, whatever. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a therapist, so I'm going to be very careful in what I try to say here. But my point is, those are kind of what I'll call the obvious things. What else do people endure or cycle into that triggers this psychological challenge of recovery?
Yep. So essentially, one of the biggest challenges that a lot of the people I see, as well as, from my own experience, as well as that of my clients, is the loss of self-identity. One of the first things you talk about when you meet someone is, what do you do? Well, if I heavily identify, which I did, as a football player for a long period of time, and I wake up the next day, I'm not a football player, anymore, and I have to look at myself in the mirror and go, well, who really am I? If that's not really what I am anymore. So it's very difficult for people to have those very, very deep conversations and look introspectively like that, as well as obviously that impacts your self-esteem, and it cascades throughout pretty much your whole life. Everyone thinks that a physical injury is just, the physical and the mental are very, very separate, but when you have an injury like that, it encapsulates your entire being. And that's something that's safe to note.
Well, go ahead if you can. Can you give us a summary of what those 6 pillars are that are in the ACT program?
Yep. So you have diffusion, which is essentially diffusing from perseverative negative thoughts. Like for myself, it was I am broken, and it's giving me the space to be able to realize I am not broken. I'm having thoughts or feelings that I'm broken, which was a very pivotal moment for me. Acceptance, which is the second pillar. It's a little different than what people normally think of when they think of mental health and acceptance. It's not really like standing in the corner and accept what happened to you. It's more so looking at your experiences and learning from them, so that you don't continually go through the same challenges in life or fall into the same issues. Then you have mindfulness, which everyone's usually very well acquainted with. It's living in the moment, not the future or the past. In which case, if you're living in the future or the past, you're likely going to be either anxious or depressed, depending on which way you're looking. And then self is a perspective, which is a bit more nuanced. Essentially, that posits that there is 2 versions of ourselves each day when we go out into the world. There's kind of the mask we wear, or the persona we're trying to put forth. Like, for example, a football player would be, tough, cool, no feelings, manly, those kinds of things. And then underneath that mask or persona, there's our true self, which is who we really are, what we're really feeling, and those kinds of things. And then you have purposeful action, which obviously without, the rest really mean not much. And then there's values, which are very similar to goals, except for instead of goals, which are kind of the stepping stones, to life, values is more so like true north. You can always head true north, but you'll never actually get there, if that makes sense. So
yeah. When you went through, you mentioned blowing out both ACLs. Were both of them, did it happen on the football field?
Yep. Different occurrences. Obviously, I didn't have a catastrophic event all at once, but yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, I mean, the first one's bad enough, but when the second one blows out, was that a different experience for you?
Yes. The second experience, obviously, the first experience, I was in college, so I had exercise scientists, physical therapists, athletic trainers who were there and really supported me through the whole thing, physically, not really psychologically or emotionally. But the second time, I was actually at a private tryout for the Canadian Football League up in Ohio. And my agent wasn't even there with me at the time. So I really went from, potentially being in the CFL at the time to now. I mean, it's pretty clear that I'm probably at least not going to be playing for a year. And I decided not to ever pick it up. And that's where I actually, Doug, I have to be very honest. I'm a very slow learner. I have to screw something up particularly bad in life to actually learn something. And this is where I actually fell into, the route that took me to where I am now. Because after that second injury, I had no assistance. I really started to abuse substances. I made really poor decisions relationally and started dating who I would find out would be a very severe alcoholic, and endured a lot of emotional abuse due to that relationship, culminating in me being suicidal for a time. So that was when I obviously knew that I needed to make a change in life. Otherwise, I wasn't going to be going the direction I wanted to. So I started going to therapy. And I'm the kind of person, if you say, hey, don't look over there, don't think that, I will only, stare over there and think that thought twice as much. So I scoured the internet and found, ACT, changed therapists, and although it's not like a magic pill, I'll never claim that, but for whatever reason, ACT worked very well for me, and I was able to start to slowly climb out of that, pit I was in. So that's kind of the 10,000 foot overview of the second ACL injury.
Yeah. And, I asked that because, with you having that unique combination of similar injuries, different legs,
Mhm.
the first one's bad enough, but when the second one impacts your real destiny as a professional athlete,
Mhm.
that had to be a ton of bricks.
Yeah, it definitely hit me hard, because the first one, I felt very confident that I'd be able to, overcome it, especially with all the, help I had. But the second one was just kind of almost nosediving off a cliff, it felt like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the work you're doing now, how where do people usually start with pursuing the kind of recovery work you're talking about?
Yep. So essentially, I see clients, much like this, where we get on the camera, and they, we talk through their issues. It's more of me walking alongside them than, traditional therapy. But essentially, people usually have like an I've had it moment. I need to make a change. What I'm doing isn't working with, my current situation, with whatever kind of physical ailment they're dealing with. And they usually reach out to me via, my website, or, maybe social media, but it generally stems from them having kind of an I've had it moment. And I also like to, direct people to, my book or my blog, because unfortunately there's only so much time in a day. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is not just turning people away and not having anything for them, because I'm very acutely aware of that kind of situation, because I was in it, and I never want to leave anyone else in that situation. So.
Yeah. What you said earlier about the whole identity thing, I experienced myself back in the 2008 timeframe. And as many of my listeners have heard me say, I had a chance. 2008 was when we had the last big economic crisis here in America. I mean, really big. Unemployment went up in double digits everywhere. People were thrown out of jobs, and I started a nonprofit to help job seekers. And it wasn't long after we opened the doors that we realized one of the chief problems that people had coming to us was the loss of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so much so, I wrote a short little ebook called You Are Not Your Job. And to your point, you walk up to somebody and say, what do you do? Well, what I started doing, I would walk up to our new people that, first time they were coming to the program, I would say, not what do you do, but I would say, tell me something about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And 100% of the time they would start in, well, I'm an engineer, I'm an accountant, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm so on. And this was men or women, both.
Yep.
And I got real bold in saying, no, you didn't answer my question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and something that I do frequently with these people, because most of the time when I'm talking to someone, they're 80% of the time or so they're wanting to return to their sport, but the 20% of the time they're actually looking to get into the quote unquote real world, where they're not really doing their sport competitively anymore. So I don't usually actually ask who are you or what do you do? I ask, why do you do what you do? Because if you can find the common themes, which is what I did, underneath that question, you can redirect someone to, well, I loved my sport because of X, Y, Z. Where can we put you on a trajectory to where you can, fulfill those yearnings in a day-to-day basis that's not directly tied to your sport. So.
The interesting challenge that I've learned over the years in doing that kind of work is that it's not uncommon that people come out of school, and maybe they do or don't go to college, but even through college, they get on a trajectory, to use your word, that has never answered, or I'm sorry, never asked the question, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
And, and as I've heard it famously quoted, three key questions: who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going?
Mm-hmm.
And it's too easy in the modern world to get spun up in activities that create direction rather than finding direction that creates activity.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, people, even those that didn't play sports, they get into their business life, their job life. They get a job because they need it. They need the paycheck. They need, they've got obligations. And then that employer gives them opportunity, maybe a next promotion or two or three promotions. And pretty soon you've got 10 or 15 years and you wake up one day and go, what is this all about?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily take a physical injury to get your attention on that idea. So it is so compelling to have people think about, why am I here?
Mm-hmm.
What am I doing? Where am I going?
Yeah, because I mean, we could, like you said, if you're just going and climbing the skyscraper towards, up higher and wherever you're at, because you're already set on that trajectory, you might get to the top of the mountain and realize you actually want to be on the mountain, 3 miles to the south from where you're actually at. So it's always beneficial to begin with the end in mind, which is something I really like to talk about, for those undergoing, whether they're just getting out of school or whether they're, making a career transition, because unfortunately they've came to the impasse that you're speaking about.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I know Stephen Covey made that phrase famous, begin with the end in mind. That was, one of his 7 habits in his pivotal book that he wrote. But it is so easy said and sometimes so hard to do. When I know the work I do with people, even business owners that are running fairly successful businesses, I'll engage with them and I'll say, why are you doing this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly.
And,
it's very.
They might say something like, well, I'm making money. Yeah, but for what reason? I mean, why? Still goes back to that basic question.
Yep. Yeah. Why is something that isn't discussed, on a wide array of issues nearly enough in today's society, unfortunately.
Right. So what can you kind of sum up the work you do into just a couple of key thoughts that people that are maybe going through that season of life, how they might start thinking about a different outcome?
So essentially, everything that I do within this space is provide information and direction to those struggling psychologically and physically with what they're currently enduring. So if maybe they have a lack of, knowledge on their particular joint injury. I have a whole blog on different knee injuries. I'm helping develop a psychological framework for physical practitioners who are generally with athletes much more commonly than psychological practitioners, because it's kind of taboo for athletes to, seek psychological help. So providing that framework and that skill set to physical practitioners, especially athletic trainers who are with athletes daily, is very, very important. And it's something I'm working on with a close group of physical therapists.
Curious comment there. Why do you think it's taboo among athletes to seek the psychological help along the way?
I think athletes themselves think it's a form of weakness. But what I discussed at length in my book is actually I tried to repackage it in a way, because athletes are notorious for being resistant to that kind of help just because of the way it looks. But I did a lot of research on ACT, and actually it makes individuals better athletes. And it also has far-ranging benefits, outside of even the workplace. It makes you a better community member, a better business person, and so on and so forth. So I try to repackage it because, as a conventional, historically, athletes are definitely not the best as far as going to seek help when they're struggling psychologically, because most times they use their sport as their coping mechanism, which is why it's so pivotal that if they have none of these psychological skills, that they seek help, because they will turn to negative coping mechanisms, which is, what I did and what many do more readily. They're much more easier to start using than the actual positive coping mechanisms.
Well, I know I'm thinking as you were saying that, the pro golfing world has not been afraid of using psychologists to help them with their games, because of course people argue, and it's probably a true statement, golf is as much a mental game as it is physical. For decades, those guys have been known to have a psychologist or a therapist in their circle of support people.
Yeah.
They might have a physical therapist and strength coach as well, but they've got a kind of a golf whisperer alongside with them, to kind of keep their head on straight.
It's definitely, as you alluded to, that's a very mental sport. It's pretty much all mental, because you have a very pivotal shot, and then you're walking, who knows how far, just with your own thoughts. Essentially, you might be talking to a caddy or something, but it's pretty much all the lead up to a short physical movement. It's all mental besides that. So it's definitely a little different than the typical sport, but they have been a little better, I suppose, at including therapists in their day-to-day lives, for sure.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, the culture that can spin out of an environment that may be prone to promote a certain thing or not. And I'm thinking in a business context, even a culture at work. I know from my own executive coaching, sometimes it's very hard to get an individual to sign up for coaching because there's a perception that it's some kind of weakness. And that, I don't want my boss to know that I've hired a coach. Well, the irony is it's just a tremendously positive investment in improving, your abilities as a leader, as an executive. And companies are usually the ones, at least the bigger companies anyway, they're the ones that come out and reach out to hire us coaches to come in and help with a population of leaders. Maybe they call them, high potentials, or they call them emerging leaders, or just literally some layer of leadership that they're willing to invest in the coaching effort. But fortunately, over the last decade or so, the stigma of having a coach, it used to mean if the company hired you a coach, you were on a bad list.
Mm-hmm.
You needed to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
But now coaching is being spun as a much more positive career longevity development opportunity, not a naughty list.
Yeah, as long as you're people need to understand that seeking to improve doesn't mean you're necessarily in a bad situation always. Obviously, there can be certain circumstances where that is the case. If you're seeing a therapist, you could potentially be in a bad place, but that's not everyone's situation. Therapy or coaching, for that matter, is can really be utilized by anyone in any situation. So,
yeah. Well, what comes to my mind is the reality that for all of us, and anybody that's listening to this, and anybody life is its own kind of contact sport, and there's a whole lot of psychology to differentiate those that are more successful at life than others.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
People that enter into a lifestyle of struggle, and there are those, the proverbial friend that has a black cloud over them all the time. My experience is inevitably that's a very key psychological challenge. It's their thinking that leads to choices that leads to bad outcomes. And if you can get into the psychology of that, you can help people like that literally turn their lives around.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, essentially. If you always think that's going to happen, you're going to act, accordingly to that, and you're going to prove yourself right more than you probably want to. So,
Right.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I mean those kinds of things can be obviously altered, but it takes work. It's usually just people's temperament or those kinds of things. And like you said, it affects not only, relationships, but it can affect their careers, their family lives, and all kinds of things. So.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Yep. So my book, Torn, is essentially my story as an athlete. It starts with me being a freshman in high school. It's when I started to have panic attacks, up through my second ACL tear, after college in the Arena Leagues and the CFL tryout, and then the subsequent emotional abuse and different kinds of situations that occurred as a result of that. And that therapy that I spoke to previously, I'm a writer just by trade, so I write because I have a very chaotic mind and I have lists everywhere and a journal and those kinds of things. And it was when I was going through my therapy, I would journal about different things that we talked about in therapy, and it came to be my book very, very organically. And I just went back and re-entered the scientific evidence behind it to kind of back up why, if I would have used ACT in these specific situations within my life, I would have been much better suited to the problems at hand. So essentially, it's kind of an advocacy for ACT to be used to, not only those who have a difficult psychological injury, but those who are struggling psychologically just as a whole.
Sounds like a great help. So, Keegan, tell everybody the best way to get a hold of you if they're wanting to know more.
Yep. My website is KeagenHadley.com, or if that's difficult to spell, the ACLtherapist.com. A little easier to spell. It'll take you to the same place. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter at the ACL Therapist.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for sitting in with us. I think this has really been insightful and hopefully helpful to somebody out there that may be listening and is, in fact, struggling with their own form of recovery. So, again, thank you, Keegan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, folks, we are going to wrap it up, and I thank you for sitting in and listening. As always, I want to remind you that we've got a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name, and hop over there if you haven't yet known about us or over there and seen it, but would love you to join in and leave a comment, give us some information, some feedback that we can use. For now, we're going to sign off, say goodbye, and hope you have a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.